By the end of July, we'll have over 600 million doses, enough to vaccinate every single American. By next Christmas, I think we'll be in a very different circumstance, God willing, than we are today.
We must be both optimistic but also patient about the route to normality, and even though some things are very uncertain, because we want this lockdown to be the last.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. Political leaders from British Prime Minister Boris Johnson to American President Joe Biden are talking up vaccines and discussing how to reopen schools and businesses. Because of people now wearing masks more and keeping their social distancing and the lockdowns in Europe, rates of COVID hospitalization and deaths are for the moment falling. Great news. But a huge number of scientists say you can't talk school openings without changing classroom sizes, the way air is circulated, mandatory masks for kids. And remember, this is an aerosol or airborne virus. And before you think vaccines will be our road back to normal, think again. The mutations in the COVID-19 pandemic are in the thousands and increasing in frequency and spread and becoming more deadly. The vaccines cannot be tweaked fast enough. And if we reopen society too quickly, we will keep having to return to lockdowns. So why aren't we talking about zero COVID before we reopen? On this backstory, two expert epidemiologists, Dr. Eric Feigl-Ding with the COVID Action Group in Washington, and here in London, Deepti Gurdasani from the Queen Mary University, both outspoken and worth listening to, especially if you're a parent. All right, Deepti Gurdasani is a senior lecturer on epidemiology and statistics genetics at Queen Mary University of London. Hi, Deepti.
Hi.
Thanks for doing this. You know, I am struck by reading a lot of science and following people like you, and then watching these government news conferences, for instance, in the United Kingdom, where the Prime Minister and his scientists, because they say they're following the science, never talk about zero COVID. Why is there this deep chasm of disconnect in Europe when the discussion never even approaches zero COVID?
Yes, I mean, I actually don't fully understand why that is. In the UK, it's broadly been thought to be, impossible or unachievable by many members of our scientific advisory group who've said this publicly. And unfortunately, discussions around zero COVID never entered the mainstream, despite, zero COVID being highly successful in many regions. It was sort of dismissed very early on as first, when it was done in Southeast Asia, as being culturally not in line with what could be achieved in the UK and Europe, because we are freedom-loving people. And when it was done in New Zealand and Australia, which are more thought to be more culturally similar, it was again dismissed as, but Europe and the UK are more interconnected. They have high population density. So there are several reasons always to suggest that Europe or the UK are exceptional in some way to make this impossible. More and more now we are hearing that New Zealand and Australia managed to get on top of this because they acted early on. And since we haven't acted early on, we cannot get on top of it now.
Acted early on,
yes.
And then life went back to normal largely because there wasn't COVID spreading rapidly. I mean, there was very few cases of it. Now they've had another outbreak between New Zealand and Australia. They're being very aggressive about the lockdown. They want to eliminate it with good track and trace systems. And then once they do that, they'll reopen again. And I was reading one of the virologists at Northumbria University this morning saying that, the Asia Pacific nations first contained the transmission, then they unlocked their economies. The attempt to return to business as usual was a bit of firefighting, which will still end up burning your house down. In other words, if you just, spray a little bit of containment on this, but let it burn, it will burn the house down.
I think that's an excellent analogy. And we followed sort of almost a policy of halfway measures in the interest, we thought, of sort of protecting the economy, protecting people's jobs, allowing education in schools, protecting our health services, without realizing that all of these things are unfortunately completely tied in with controlling COVID. And unless you get on top of COVID, you can't protect your economy, you can't protect your health services, and you can't provide undisrupted education for children. I think the countries who understood that early on treated COVID as a threat that it was, rather than minimizing it, and took aggressive action, are the ones who won out. And countries who minimize the risk posed by this, compared it to flu, followed a policy of halfway measures, talking about suppression, flattening the curve, maintaining hospitalizations just below capacity. Well, that never worked, because we've been in restrictions now for the longest time. In the UK, we're now in our third lockdown. And all of this is a result of, paradoxically, trying to protect the economy and people's liberties.
Right. We've just extended this revolving door of lockdowns. And now they're saying this is likely the last lockdown. The newspapers are full of headlines today talking about Prime Minister Boris Johnson's plans to reopen the economy in the next few months. Do you think that they're dreaming?
I mean, I think certainly with that rhetoric, they are dreaming. I mean, if you're talking about reopening now and talking about acceptable deaths, living with the virus, then I think in the same breath, you can't be talking about this being the last lockdown, because essentially we've been here many times before, and it's very predictable what happens from here. This is not rocket science. We know that if you start opening up early, you see surges in cases. You see that all over Europe. And unfortunately, after 3 lockdowns, to me, it's quite astonishing that the government still hasn't learned from this. And we're still planning to go ahead, open up against the advice, actually, even from the scientific advisory group at this point in time. For example, yesterday, there was a paper out in the London School of Hygiene that clearly shows that almost in all scenarios, opening schools up, whether it's primary or secondary schools or both in the UK, will lead to surges in cases are above 1 and exponential rises resuming, which obviously would mean very soon another lockdown, school closures, and all the devastating impacts of that.
Well, there's a lot of debate in that conversation, though, isn't there? Because the science, as quoted by the government at least, seems to be that the spread is pretty minimal in certain age groups of children. I mean, I've got a 13-year-old who's at home and a 16-year-old. So it's very different between the two of them and the bubbles in their schools and whether they wear masks or not. And as you know, they're at home right now. But you're interesting, because I looked at one of your tweets and you said more misinformation on the BBC on schools, no mention of data based on regular testing of asymptomatic children in households, which shows the opposite. When will the media get this right?
Yeah.
So you're saying that the statistics on minimizing the spread by children, between children, and back into their households is misleading because it doesn't take into account asymptomatic cases, and they are the majority of the cases.
Yes, I mean, exactly. So it's not just that it underestimates cases in children. The problem is when you only test symptomatic people, children are less likely to be represented, and often you're more likely to pick up the adults that they infect. So not only are you underestimating infection in children, you're misidentifying very likely an adult as an index case or as a source of infection, whereas it's very likely to have been the child from the school. And there's a lot of evidence now to support this from many studies that have now looked at more asymptomatic transmission based on regular testing in the community and in schools. So, for example, if you look at the Office for National Statistics data, if you just look at the trends of infection rates in children or infection positivity in children over time in the UK, you'll see that infection rates in primary and secondary schools children were some of the highest at the end of October and November, and closely reflected school openings and closures. So we have a half term that happens in October, during which, both those sort of declined and then came up again. And it's hard to explain why the prevalence of infection would be the highest in those age groups if it's just a reflection of, infection in the community. And to provide even more robust evidence for this, the Office for National Statistics has actually done household surveys of people who were detected to have infection based on random sampling of the population. So this is not a biased sampling that's dependent on children having symptoms.
But what is the answer? What is the answer? Because they've got to go back to school, right?
Oh, yes, they do absolutely have to go back to school. But I think they have to go back to a school in a way that we can maintain R below 1. So transmission remains low within schools and from schools back to the community. I mean, the current mitigatory measures in the UK are very focused on things like fomite transmission and hygiene, which is actually not the major mode of transmission of SARS-CoV-2. And there's very little attention given to aerosol transmission. There is early evidence from many parts of the world to suggest that mitigatory measures in schools can reduce transmission and the impact of school openings. And our measures are completely out of line with, for example, the CDC guidance and what many countries in Europe have adopted. So, for example, we don't have in England mask wearing within classrooms, either in secondary or primary schools. We don't have any social distancing. We have essentially open windows as attention to ventilation, but no further than this, no monitoring of ventilation. And the class sizes in the UK are some of the largest in Europe. We have no cap on bubble sizes. So many schools have bubbles that are up to several hundred students, so up to 300 children. And all of those things contribute to transmission. And I think, yes, it's very important that children have a level of, face-to-face or in-person learning in schools, because that's very important for children's well-being. But we need to have safety measures in place. And we also need to have options for parents who are clinically vulnerable or whose children are vulnerable, who may not want to send their children for in-person teaching. So we need to have that sort of option for parents. And we also need to have mitigatory measures in place.
Is there, I work in the media, right? So I find it hard to believe that there's media bias, but you clearly think there is, because you were invited on the BBC program, which tends to give the government, I think, probably a pretty easy pass on some of these things. And when you said that you want to talk about zero COVID, they kind of withdrew the invitation. Why is there not a more robust discussion? And again, that we kind of go back to where I started the interview with you. Why is there not a more robust discussion on I don't want to call it state media, but it is state-funded media. But why do they not really call out the government and say, what the hell? The UK is an island. Why didn't they shut it down? They allowed tens and tens of thousands of people to arrive through the airports day by day, through the summer, through the fall, through even Christmas when they had the new variant starting. Only now have they shut down a lot of the air traffic. They still, I think, have 20,000 people arriving a day. And, they're saying that they're going to put people from so-called red zone countries like South Africa in hotel quarantine for 10 days. We're a year into this. It just seems like they've bungled this.
Those policies don't even go far enough. Even their own scientific advisory group have said that those policies are not going to prevent the import of new variants or infections into the country, because they need to be far more comprehensive. So those policies seem to be more of a PR exercise than anything that's actually going to contribute to reducing new variants coming into the country.
Right. I don't understand the PR exercise. Is it just to make the government make it look like they're taking action when they really reluctantly don't want to take any action at all? Because why? Like, what do they win at the end of this if they don't shut it down?
I actually think that it's a real lack of understanding that this sort of short-term prioritization of the economy. I think that's what's happening. They don't want to restrict, for example, travel restrictions from all over the world and have managed quarantine from all over the world because of, the potential impact on the economy. But I think there's a complete lack of understanding that this is actually short-term thinking. If you import a new variant that, for example, puts vaccine effectiveness at risk, and vaccines are the major part of your pandemic strategy, and you've invested billions in those vaccines, then actually that's false economy. And that's something that I think the government has never really understood. There's still a lot of pressure from within the government to open up, to balance everything with the economy. And I think that's what's literally killing us and killing the economy. Because if they took a slightly longer term view, we could actually protect the economy much better by following an elimination strategy and preventing sort of new variants coming in that would actually potentially devastate our society and economy.
I want to ask you about the new variants. Do you think, the government keeps saying they're vaccinating, they're going to have everybody vaccinated by the autumn.
Yeah.
Then they're going to roll out maybe some new vaccines that will be massaged to deal with these new variants that are coming. I mean, it seems like we're in a race with the new variants, and the government doesn't, believes the promises from the drug manufacturing companies that, yeah, no problem, we'll go back in the lab and we'll deal with this. Do you believe it's that easy?
So I don't think it's as straightforward as it's made out to be. I think there's a huge amount of uncertainty. So I think one thing is, while chemically manufacturing a new mRNA vaccine might be relatively straightforward, testing it, validating it, getting it, past regulatory approvals, showing that proof of immunity, safety, etc., will take time. And the problem right now is that with the level of transmission that we have and the sort of poor border restrictions we have, we are identifying one new variant in the UK every week. I think at last count, there are at least 4 new variants of concern that are circulating within the UK, including many whose properties we don't actually fully understand. And while we might be, trying, making these vaccines now that, will be validated and tested over a period of time, there's no guarantees that they're going to be effective against the strains that are out then, whose properties we might understand much later and the importance of which we might understand much later. So as you say, it's between a race between vaccination and evolution. And we need to remember one thing: a lot of these variants have evolved against a background where the majority of the population wasn't immune to the virus. As more and more of the population becomes immune to the virus with higher levels of vaccination, we should expect more adaptation, because that's just what happens with viruses.
I thought we would expect less because there would be less circulation for longer in a host. That's not correct?
So there's, it's actually the level of transmission that makes a difference. So yes, if vaccines rapidly bring down transmission, and if transmission is low, they will reduce the risk of virus adaptation. But that's not really what happens with vaccines, because, for example, now we vaccinated 20% of the population, which doesn't have a major impact on R and isn't having a major impact on R. And that's entirely expected. So if transmission is allowed to continue side by side with vaccination, then actually you see higher levels of evolution, because you have people who are, I guess, immune to a particular variant of virus. So variants that escape are more likely to become dominant. So for example, we have variants such as, which carry mutations like the ones in the South Africa variant that we're really concerned about in terms of efficacy. And we're hearing from, senior advisors to the government that these are not concerning because they're not likely to become dominant. But the problem is that when you create a different environment for viruses with high levels of selection pressure, it's very likely that these variants become dominant because vaccines just don't have the same impact on them. And similarly, more variants evolve that vaccines don't have the same level of impact on. So it's very likely that we will see more and more adaptation, and possibly even at a higher rate than we are seeing now if transmission remains high. And that's a very important caveat. And one of the important reasons that many of us think it's very important to suppress transmission during vaccine rollout, because the only way to actually prevent adaptation is to eliminate the virus and really suppress transmission. There's no other way that we can control adaptation of the virus and prevent this happening. And the consequences of this are really uncertain. We cannot predict what's going to happen. So it's very important to actually reduce that uncertainty by driving towards elimination.
Is this the last lockdown?
I really hope so, but the rhetoric from government doesn't give me a lot of hope. I really hope that the government changes its strategy in line with evidence and policy. And I think if they take a long-term strategy to this and really hold out just a little bit longer before easing restrictions, fix their test trace, isolate the symptoms so that when cases come down, we can keep them down and have much better quarantine at borders so we can prevent importing cases once they come down. I think if they put those 3 measures in place, we can potentially have this as the last lockdown, but I think it entirely depends on what the government is going to do at this point.
Deepti Gurdasani, it's great to talk to you, and thank you so much for all of this science look at this. And obviously, we should be following the science more than the business and the politics of it. So, thank you so much.
Well, thanks for having me.
All right, I take you to Washington now, and Dr. Eric Feigl-Ding is a well-known epidemiologist and a health economist. And, Eric, I didn't realize, because I've talked to you before, that you were one of the very first people who really rang the alarm bells back in January when you realized what kind of scientific results we were starting to see from China, and that you were very worried, and you must be at this point, a year into this, incredibly frustrated about how bad we've been in the West in dealing with this.
Yeah, it's been a very, very long year. It's now well over a year, and we're still at this. We're still fighting misinformation. We're still fighting people trying to downplay it. And by people, I don't just mean the political spectrum. I also mean a lot of even some, scientists who long dismissed at the beginning, there's no asymptomatic transmission. Come on, that's crazy. There's asymptomatic transmission. There's no reinfection. That's not possible within a year or so. Now we clearly know with the variants, you can have reinfection. Or there's no, it's not that airborne. It's just 6 feet. Just keep your 6 feet and you're good. But clearly we know that this is an aerosol airborne virus. So, it's been fighting against, many denialism and downplayingism. And here we are.
You have the COVID Action Group, that's a group of how many scientists then?
Oh, like a dozen or two scientists. But we are trying to drive advocacy. And COVID Action Group, we're a little more US focused, but it's kind of like the Independent Sage that the UK has, in which
Independent Sage is a panel of scientists who provide,
which is also a panel of scientists trying to give government advice. Yeah, it's in certain ways, like government scientists say the most, conservative or the most absolute thing that they're sure about. But there are things, especially in this world, where we're concerned on many fronts about the pandemic, in which not all the evidence is in, but there is a precautionary principle. And in certain ways, I lean towards, one side, you could be wrong, and there's no real bad outcome if you're wrong. But on the other side, you could be right. And if you are right, even if it's a smaller chance, it could have really, really deadly or large pandemic impacts.
Give me a practical example.
Well, I think like asymptomatic transmission. People said, well, we're not sure. We can't for certain know there's asymptomatic. We don't have enough data to for sure know that that's true.
And in the end, it turned out that most people
It turned out, 30, 40, 50% of all transmissions are done by asymptomatic, pre-symptomatic people. And, but if we took the precaution, let's just assume it's true.
Yeah.
We could have stopped the pandemic way, way earlier or mitigated way, way more. And same with aerosol. People who said, 6 feet's enough. You don't have evidence that it is airborne and flowing through the whole world and, traveling. Even when someone leaves the room, someone else enters and there's no one. It's not. There's droplets fall to the ground. No. Had we taken the precaution that it is airborne, because it's a respiratory virus, and like many other respiratory viruses, these aerosols float in the air for a long time, we would have protected people a lot better if we had put in the guidelines from the beginning.
But I mean, the World Health Organization was one of those organizations that didn't take aerosol. I wouldn't say they didn't take it seriously, but they were very late. And there was that letter that went out, I think, probably late summer from a number of scientists that said, this is airborne. And WHO just didn't quite latch onto it for weeks and weeks.
Yeah. And, it's not just WHO, it was also CDC. There's many other virologist scientists. In certain ways, aerosol science is an environmental science. It's actually from the science of air pollution, particulate matter. And they've studied aerosols and as well as viruses in these aerosols, traveling aerosols, for a long, long time. Well, virologists, they're more molecular biologists and geneticists of viruses. So in certain ways, this pandemic expertise is not defined to any single small domain. We need sociologists and public health communicators to help people understand about vaccines. We need aerosol scientists and these engineers to design better air cleaning systems and understand air ventilation dynamics. Because one thing we know in environmental health, the solution to pollution is dilution, and ventilation is that dilution.
Yeah, I care about this because I'm sending my kids back to school, They're in the UK. They're probably going to go back on March the 8th. I was talking to my 16-year-old today, and he said, yeah, originally when we went back just before Christmas, in September, all the windows were open. And then they kind of, started closing the windows because it was too chilly. And then kind of they closed all the windows, and we were wearing masks, but then we weren't. And so, it started off well, probably in London schools, and then, just deteriorated because everybody got a false sense of security somehow.
Yeah. And I think this false sense of security is oftentimes fomented by people who say, well, we don't know if there's truly risks. The risks are not actually there. Whenever what they actually mean is, well, we don't know for sure. There could be risks, but they're not proven. And had we taken just the precautionary side, what if if you're wrong, it's not airborne? You know what? No one's hurt by opening the windows, and it turned out it's not airborne. But you could actually save and prevent the pandemic so much more, by taking this precaution, leaning towards the precaution. And WHO, there are advocates who are much more, let's just say, progressively for great acknowledgement of these risks. And I think Dr. Mike Ryan of WHO actually, he's actually Irish. He said, if you cannot wait, if you try to wait until you're absolutely sure about something, you will lose against the pandemic. Perfection is the enemy of good during a pandemic response. And I think that is just so correct. And, that's has been my philosophy from the beginning. We knew that this was infectious, and we knew that this had pandemic potential, and people needed to prepare. But we were talking about it's just the flu in mass media all the way until March. And now we're still talking about, schools are safe, whenever clearly there's so many evidence that schools cannot just be willy-nilly safe. You can't have sweet little lies to yourselves that they're safe. You have to take precautions to make them safe. And precautions
so
meaning
what do you say to a mother or a father listening to this, and they want to send their kids back to school because they got to get back to school, and they have to get back to a social environment. They've got to get back to learning with people.
I agree.
But we care about our kids' health. So what do you say to? Well, I'm confused.
Well, to say
and I
to
do
them,
this
first
for a
of all,
living and interviewing experts about COVID-19.
Yeah. So first of all, I have a kid. He's 7. He's rambunctious. He needs school. What I want to emphasize to people is I'm not against opening schools. There are radicals who are against opening schools and radicals for opening schools and ignoring all the risk in science. I'm for safe reopening. And safe reopening means taking not just the precautions of mandatory masks, where some places it's not mandatory, and that's very scary.
So wear them all day long in the classroom?
Yeah, you should. And also, we should implement testing weekly, at least, for teachers and preferably kids if they can handle it. But, many other schools, there are schools in some countries that are doing mandatory testing, once or twice a week for all students as well. Mm-hmm. So I think you should have testing weekly. And I think you have to make sure that, some of the CDC guidelines here in the US say, just maintain 6 feet and then you can have indoor sports. No, you can't just say that is enough. You have to emphasize ventilation. 6 feet is not enough. And you can't do 6 feet, for example, for wrestling, right? You can't do 6 feet for those. And you can try to think, 6 feet in basketball, but that's not how the sport is run. You have to be honest with ourselves. And unless you put in the ventilation systems, the air cleaning systems, by air cleaning, I mean, if a room has poor ventilation, you either put in a HEPA filter, or for large gymnasiums, you put in upper air UV, where UV lights shine towards the ceiling, not down. And then you circulate the air up and down. That's upper air UV. It's actually a very efficient system. Or there's even, if for a school that has absolutely no money whatsoever for any of these, there's something called, for example, a Corsi box. And a Corsi box is take these air filters, these 20-inch by 20-inch air filters that you put in your homes, and you take a box fan and you simply create a cube out of this, with the box fan being one side, and take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 additional of these filters, and you can create this a HEPA filter equivalent box that can, disinfect and remove viruses, assuming you use the right filters. And it's been actually shown by aerosol scientists, this is actually quite an efficient system.
Oh, that's
and this
really clever.
costs nothing more than a box and a few filters.
As we speak, the British newspapers, because we've been under a lockdown since before Christmas. I mean, and I hate to use the term lockdown, because while I've been at home and my kids have been at home, there's lots of construction workers that get on the tube every day and get on buses and go to work. And so so-called essential workers that are doing house renovations, I don't think that's essential. But anyway, the lockdown, depending on where you are, but the numbers are falling now, but we're still above 10,000 cases estimated per day. And now the big talk here is how to reopen everything. Do you think that they're being dangerously soft in terms of the pressures from business groups that want to get their pubs and their shops and their restaurants opening, and that they shouldn't open too soon?
Yeah, I'm in the zero COVID belief that it's better if we not have these yo-yoing up and down roller coasters of opening and closing and opening and closing, because we've seen this time and time again. It is not the right idea. And we've seen, we can't, the other analogy is if you eat bacon a lot and you have high cholesterol and you switch to eating vegetarian and vegan for a month, it's not like once you switch back to bacon again that the bacon doesn't harm you again. We know that people spread it, right?
Also, just to interrupt you, I also like this analogy that somebody wrote that said, you've opened your parachute on the way down and you've now decreased the velocity of the fall, so it's okay to take your parachute off.
Yeah, of course. You have to. We are on a downhill roll towards the natural velocity of this virus is to spread. What we need to do is truly, truly eliminate the virus so that it cannot keep pushing us down the hill. And I know it's an uphill fight, but it is possible. We are, UK right now is approximately R of 0.8. The cases are dropping in a lockdown. And if we just resist longer, we can get it to zero. And once you're at near zero, where we can trace, small outbreaks very vigilantly, and the chance of it cropping up is so much lower. And UK is an island, so
we're an island, and New Zealand's done it, and Australia's done it.
New Zealand's done it. Many other places that are not islands have done it. Vietnam is a very densely populated place. It's not an island. It's not wealthy in any way, but they took the zero COVID approach. It's possible. When you're so close, don't give up, because once you give up, it will allow the virus to spread again. But if you just get it down to zero, there is, 0 times 50,000, 100,000, millions of people moving around means zero, because you're at zero. So it's just, if you just held out for a little bit longer.
That's not even being talked about in the US, is it?
In the US, we have political issues that are obviously a lot more difficult. For example, mask mandates, school closings, all these kind of things are, Joe Biden cannot mandate every single state to follow his rules. He can do it for, federal public transits kind of things and federal buildings, but he can't mandate it on a local level. But UK has this, hopefully more efficient, or at least England, it can be more efficient and mandated. And this is in certain ways, a better central control has that advantage in governance. But you guys can do it.
Yeah.
I know you guys can. And because you guys are relatively wealthy of an island, it's, it has the resources to do that. It has the testing. You guys found the B117 when I'm pretty sure there's many other strains, but it's just you guys found it fast because you guys have the genomics surveillance and the technical expertise. UK has all the combination. It knows how to manufacture vaccines, design vaccines, do genomic surveillance, do all these other testing, and has the advantage of being wealthy and an island. So if any place in the world that should be able to do it, UK should be able to do it.
but they won't because although they're talking about this being the last lockdown. So listen, you mentioned mutations and then you tweeted something, I think in the last few days, that there's something going on with this mutation, 7 striking new converging variants with the same 677 mutations. What is that?
That's in the US. The US, they found several variants that all share the same mutation in the variants. There's other mutations too, but they all have this one in common. And it's just very striking how it's something called convergent evolution, where once something is advantageous, many others will also learn the same skill. And this is why owls and bats both learn to fly, even though the owls and bats are not anywhere near the same evolutionary tree. But they all converged on evolutionary adaptation. So the virus has also adapted in that way. And the UK B117 also has advantageously adapted. There's the 501 Nelly a mutation that many others also have, and is also acquired the E4A4K in the sublineage in Wales and England that allows it to evade antibodies, just like South Africa and Brazil one does.
Evade antibodies, evade vaccines? Are you
no, so basically this variant has acquired the E4A4K, nicknamed EEK mutation. And this mutation has been shown in South Africa that people who were previously infected and should have immunity had almost no immunity, and very little, and a large portion of people had no advantageous antibody recognition of the new variants with this EEK mutation. And for vaccines, it was highly attenuated. Instead of 80, 90% or 75, it was 50 or 60% efficacy because of this. And this is most predominantly in the South African Brazil variant, but the Kent UK B117 variant, for most part, don't have it, but there's a sublineage separately in Wales and in England that they learned it. So this is what we call convergent evolution. Like these mutations, they will always adapt to something that makes them much more fit and rigorous and faster spreading and can penetrate immunity better. And so this is why the longer we let the virus circulate, the more of these mutations we're going to accumulate. So and the more of this whack-a-mole and more lockdowns.
Sorry, what was the last part?
Well, more mutations, more surges, more lockdowns. And so I think it's crazy for them to say, oh, this will be the last lockdown. They don't know what else could be coming. B117 has already dominated the UK, but B117 is good for infecting virgin fields of uninfected people. But the South Africa variant or UK subvariant with this EEK mutation can invade areas in which people have already been infected and think they're immune, but they're not. And it's also shown that the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine is pretty weak against this South Africa variant. So if anything, and most of Europe is reliant on the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, which is good for the older strains and the UK strain, but not against these mutated ones.
This is where you really come back. This is why you really come back to zero.
Yeah, so zero is just so much better. A virus cannot mutate if it can't replicate. That's the main thing I want people to remember. No more mutations if there's no more virus. And the virus cannot survive being muzzled, but the virus can adapt to in more and more people if you just let it float around. And we've seen it with many immunocompromised people, that one immunocompromised people, they think that's how the Kent variant arose. One immunocompromised person just allowed 20 mutations to arise from their bodies because they couldn't defeat the virus, and the virus learned how to defeat the person.
Is there ridiculous thinking, to use my term, but you can massage that how you want, in suggesting that, well, okay, let's just get everybody vaccinated. We'll reopen. And then, as the variants mutate, we can massage every vaccine and, we'll just give you another vaccination in the autumn or at Christmas time.
A booster.
A booster.
Yeah. But before now and then, boosters are not coming soon enough. Boosters still have to go through clinical trial testing. Unfortunately, it'll take quite a while unless they shortcut it somehow. It will be quite a while before we have the booster. If we have a booster now, we can adapt. But this is not the last mutation. This is just the mutations that we're talking about now. There's going to be so many, many more mutations. The variety is the spice of life, right? And whenever it's challenged, it's the reason oftentimes we see mutations is either someone's immunocompromised, and then they're very weak immune system, not able to fully suppress it, just like our lockdowns. If it's not very strict and not long enough, can't suppress it. These mutations will crop up, and there's something some folks are worried that these mutations that can evade immunity will crop up whenever we hit herd immunity. So basically, the closer we are to 80%, 90% vaccinated, then the virus is running out of virgin fields of people to infect who've never been infected before. So then it will evolve to try to evade. It's kind of like when the walls are closing in, when a dog is cornered, it will get desperate and try to find ways to skip over this fence. And right now, our fence is not nearly high enough. What you have to do is you have to vaccinate and lock down at the same time very quickly to muzzle this out. And once you muzzled it out and it's gone, then you can basically live on with your normal lives again. And that's what people want. People want normal lives, not yo-yo uncertainty. And I guarantee you, if we reopen too quickly, we're going to have this yo-yo uncertainty. This virus will come raging back once you reopen everything. And schools, obviously, it's a complicated issue. Schools, it does increase transmission. But if you take all the mitigations, it won't increase it as much. And if you mitigate other things, you can still allow, it's kind of like a buffer. You can still allow for some school transmission and still keep the R under 1, right? Keeping the R under 1 is key. So if you lower everything else low enough, you can allow a little bit of school transmission and still have the overall trend go down. And, honestly, that's maybe perhaps the best. But you can't just swing open the doors, because school reopening is this very, very subjective thing. Are you swinging the doors open without masks and any ventilation precaution? Or are you doing it with masks, ventilation, HEPA filters, or this Corsi box approach, and with testing and all these other things that can help protect the school and the community? If you reopen carefully, yes, you can. But the fear is when you simply say it's safe to reopen, it becomes read as, oh, it's okay, kids are not at risk. Whenever that's clearly not the case. Anybody who says kids are not at risk or kids don't transmit in school are just blindly naive or just deceiving.
Really have a range in there, and I'll let you go because I know we've talked for a long time, and I appreciate your insight. But from Asia, where they really shut it down and they did zero COVID, and then New Zealand and Australia, and then in Europe, where it's been kind of allowed to perk along, but there have been some pretty serious lockdowns, and we're at the end of 2 months now. We 2 months now in the UK, and then to places like Florida, where I talked to somebody this week, and they said, oh, we're not doing what you guys are doing over there. We've learned to live with this virus. And so it seems like we really go to an extreme in Florida.
Yeah, well, Florida is just a different hellhole. But I think UK of all places can win. I think it has the resources, it has the expertise, it has the centralized government that, if it wanted to, could achieve zero COVID.
Politically, they can do it. They can bring it home if they want to. Yeah,
they can just, it's that last mile, that last kilometer of effort, in running a marathon that's hardest. But if you can reach the promised land by just persevering a little bit longer, right? Like UK famously made the keep calm and carry on. Right now, we need to keep on the lockdown and carry on until we hit that zero or near zero level.
It's daunting, but nobody wants to have wasted the last 2 months and return back and do this all again 3 months from now. Dr. Eric Feigl-Ding. Eric, thanks so much.
Thank you. Stay safe.
And that's our backstory on Zero COVID. I'm publishing a newsletter on Substack. It's danalewis.substack.com. And there I try to lead you through some of the big stories of the day and recommend what you can read on News of the Day. Sign up if you like. It's free, as is this podcast. All I ask is you subscribe and please share it. Thanks for listening to Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis, and I'll talk to you again soon.